From mountaintops to valleys and over land and sea, a plane has got to keep flying. It's not easy to stay aloft for more than a few hours. So how about 571? Buckle up your seatbelts because today we're re-looking at the top 10 facts of the miracle of Flight 571. Number 10. The plane. On October 13, 1972, an Uruguayan Air Force C-47 military transport aircraft was scheduled to take off from Uruguay for Lima, Peru. This was meant to be a routine flight that would allow some members of the Uruguayan Air Force to attend a conference in Peru. However, this was no ordinary flight. The crew of the plane had planned to stop off at Montana dos Colinos Airport in Bolivia, where they were going to refuel before continuing on their way to Peru. But when the time came to fly, there was a problem. The pilot of the plane made a bad call and decided to continue the journey without refueling first. Bad call, because this soon led to them having to make an emergency landing. As soon as the pilots realized that they couldn't make it to their destination, they started looking for a place to put down. They spotted a small clearing surrounded by tall mountains and made the decision to attempt to land here. What could possibly go wrong? Well, turns out the plane overshot the runway, touched down hard, and flipped over several times before finally coming to a stop. Once it came to a stop, it burst into flames. Of the 17 people who were on board the plane, only 8 survived. The crash left a lot of questions unanswered. How did the pilot make such a disastrous call? How did so few people survive the crash? No, 9, a second chance. The 8 survivors of the crash quickly found themselves facing harsh conditions. The area they had landed in was very remote and bitterly cold. The temperature dropped as low as 30 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 1 degree Celsius. The crash site was also around 12,000 feet or 3,600 meters above sea level, which meant that the survivors were struggling to get enough oxygen. To make matters worse, 3 of the survivors suffered serious injuries and were unlikely to make it. Despite all of these challenges, 4 of the survivors set off on a trek through the mountains in search of help. They walked for days and eventually made it to a small village. Once they reached the village, they managed to alert the authorities and a rescue party was sent back to the crash site. When the rescue party arrived, they were shocked to find that 2 of the injured survivors had died, and the other 6 were barely clinging to life. All 8 survivors were taken to hospital, where they were treated for their injuries. Although their ordeal was far from over, the fact that they had been rescued was cause for celebration. In fact, the captain of the rescue helicopter later said that he thought it was a miracle that anyone had survived the crash, let alone that anyone could have survived the conditions that they had been in. Number 8. Not giving up hope. After spending almost a month in hospital, 7 of the 8 survivors were well enough to be discharged. However, one of them, an 18-year-old man named Roberto Canessa, remained in a coma. The doctors told his family that there was no hope of him ever waking up. But Roberto's mother refused to believe this. She stayed by her son's bedside every day, talking to him and praying that he would make a recovery. Eventually, her hard work paid off. After 39 days in a coma, Roberto opened his eyes. Mother was overjoyed, but she knew that her son still had a long road to recovery ahead of him. Roberto had suffered severe hypothermia and frostbite, which meant that he had lost the tips of several fingers and both of his big toes. He also had to relearn how to walk and talk. But with the support of his mother and the medical staff, he made a remarkable recovery. In fact, he went on to make a full recovery and live a normal life. Number 7. Hunger and thirst. One of the biggest challenges faced by the survivors was staying hydrated. The climate in the Andes Mountains is very dry, and so it was difficult for them to find water. To make matters worse, the plane that had crashed was carrying a supply of jet fuel, which the survivors were unable to access. This meant that they had to rely on melting snow for water, which was a slow and difficult process. However, despite these challenges, the survivors were able to stay alive thanks to their determination and the help of some unexpected sources. For example, some local farmers who heard about the survivors' plight donated cows and sheep, which the survivors were able to slaughter and eat. In addition, the survivors were able to supplement their diet with wild berries and herbs. These food sources may not have been ideal, but they helped the survivors to stay alive until they were rescued. Number 6. Keeping warm. The survivors of Flight 571 had to endure temperatures as low as 30 degrees. Fahrenheit or -1 degree Celsius. To keep warm, they used whatever materials they had available to them, including the plane's upholstery, blankets, and even their own clothing. They huddled together for warmth and built a makeshift shelter out of the plane's wreckage. However, despite their best efforts to stay warm, several of the survivors suffered from severe hypothermia. Hypothermia occurs when the body's core temperature drops below 95 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 degrees Celsius. This can lead to confusion, slurred speech, and eventually death. Fortunately, the survivors were eventually rescued and taken to hospital, where they were treated for their injuries. However, the experience left many of them with long-term health problems. Several survivors suffered from chronic pain, and some even lost limbs due to frostbite. No, 5, the survivors. Of the 8 survivors, 4 died shortly after being rescued due to complications from their injuries. 2 of the survivors died from hypothermia, and the other 2 died after contracting bacterial infections. In fact, the bacterial infections were most likely caused by the contaminated water that the survivors had been drinking. The remaining 4 survivors, however, made full recoveries. After the disaster, several of the survivors became well-known public figures. For example, Roberto Canessa, who had been in a coma for 39 days, became a doctor and wrote a book about his experience. Another survivor, Liliana Chiabrando, became a television host and actress. Yet another survivor, Cecilia Bodia, became a lawyer and human rights activist. Number 4. Theories. There have been many theories put forward about why the plane crashed. The most popular theory is that the pilot simply made a mistake. He may have been disoriented, or he may have misjudged the plane's altitude or speed. Whatever the reason, he made a fatal error that caused the plane to crash. However, some people have speculated that there was more to the crash than just pilot error. Some people believe that the plane was sabotaged, while others believe that it was the victim of foul play. However, there is no evidence to support either of these theories. In fact, the official investigation concluded that the crash was caused by pilot error. Number 3. Rescue. The rescue operation was one of the most daring and difficult operations ever undertaken. The crash site was extremely difficult to reach, and the rescuers had to brave bad weather and treacherous terrain. However, they were determined to save the survivors, and they eventually succeeded in rescuing all 8 of them. In fact, the rescue operation was so daring that it was later made into a film called The Miracle of Flight 571. The film starred Jake Gyllenhaal and was released in 2017. No. 2. Aftermath. In the aftermath of the crash, the Uruguayan government launched an investigation to determine what had caused the accident. The investigation concluded that the crash was caused by a combination of factors, including pilot error, mechanical problems, and bad weather conditions. As a result of the investigation, several changes were made to aviation safety regulations in Uruguay. The crash also had a profound impact on the survivors. Many of them suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and other mental health problems. However, they received counseling and other forms of therapy to help them cope with their injuries. Number 1. Remembering the victims. Sadly, 8 people lost their lives in the crash. A memorial service was held in their honor, and they were remembered as heroes. In fact, several of the victims were awarded posthumous medals for their bravery. The crash of Flight 571 is a reminder of the fragility of life. However, it is also a testament to the human spirit and the will to survive. The survivors of Flight 571 are true heroes, and their story will never be forgotten. Did you know anything about this plane crash? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on more videos like this one. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.